make sure. Now tell me, can you tell me, are you seeing my notes version or are you seeing my regular version?
Nope, we're seeing the version we should see. Beautiful background.
That makes me so happy. Sometimes I get 2 slides in before anyone tells me you're seeing my slides, my next note. So thanks for the opportunity to be here as part of the conference. As has been mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work with Friends of the Upper Delaware and with the Academy of Natural Sciences on this project that Tanya just presented on. And I want to frame, though the topic on the agenda was stream assessment. You've been hearing a lot about stream assessment so far today. The Trotta environmental folks talked about an incredible tools for stream assessment, and Tanya was talking about stream assessment. My special sauce here is talking a little bit on the clean water programs, the clean water framework, if you will, at the state level, and how it impacts locally and where some of it comes from the federal level. But we'll be talking a little bit more about policy and regulation, and I think of it as the backdrop that's important to help us understand some of the questions that have come up regarding what do we do with these data, where do we look for more, how do we make use of them in the Upper Delaware to really understand leverage our power and our opportunities. So I want to start with relevance here. Is this you? I really wanted to find a female fly fishing picture, but consider yourself in there as well. I will be talking a lot about how this is relevant for maintaining the quality of the work that I think about in terms of stream assessment and programs and policies, and how it really comes back to an important part of understanding and maintaining the quality of the fisheries and the amazing water bodies that have been talked about already today. And I want to make a clarification, because sometimes people hear the word policy and think politics. We also had the opportunity to hear from the Assemblywoman and the League of Conservation Voters to talk about the politics. That's definitely an important piece, how the money comes down, how the elected officials engage in this piece of paradise. What I'm talking about is what state and local agencies and federal agencies develop in terms of policies and how they will protect these waters, or how they categorize them, or how they take their information into account as they decide what the rules of the road, if you will, what the regulations might be, what the permits might be. And so we won't get it too much into permitting or anything, but we will be talking about where what we need to understand in some of the regulatory framework here. So I think of step one, I want to understand current water quality. We've been hearing a lot about that. And there's 2 pieces to this that I want to talk a little bit about. One is the how you assess or compile information about water quality, and the other is how you compare it against standards. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by standards. So we've heard from, as I mentioned, Trotta Environmental and from Tanya about how data and information are collected on our water bodies. The state of New York has their role, their steps that they take to collect data, and it happens on a rotating basis, that is, where they come into different water bodies in the state in about a 5 to 7 year cycle. And when they do that, they are not sampling everywhere. And that's not something that we could ever expect them to do. But what's important, and I hope we'll think about and take home from this short time we have together, is what are the places that need to be assessed when the state's doing this work, and can they better understanding, and can they do a better job of combining their information with that from the Delaware River Basin Commission, the acronym there, DRBC, the other federal agencies like the U.S. Geological Survey collect data in the basin, universities and volunteers, as has already been brought up. Where and how can we use the information from all these numerous sources to better inform the work that happens on policy and regulation? What the state looks at first are the bugs, kind of like what Tanya was talking about. They definitely drive their assessment, their understanding of whether a water body is okay or not by what's going on with the macroinvertebrates. There are other calculations or other samples that they take for temperature and oxygen, other what they call conventional pollutants, as well as chemicals, but it's really not their starting point, and it's fewer and farther between when we see those type of data. So I captured some information. There's so much, as we've already been talking about, that is collected in these kind of mapping formats in the geological information systems that the public has access to. In this case, there are maps that characterize what New York calls their water body inventory or their priority water body list. And so in grabbing, I'm going to double check that you can see. Can you see my cursor here? In here, someone? Okay, thanks. So we've got here, Hancock is right here, and this is the West Branch and the East Branch going up to Pacton, and the main stem cut off, not because nothing happens in Pennsylvania, but because we're focusing on New York here. And I'm just going to point out a couple things, and then we might come back to this map as well. The dots, the blue-green dots, are where New York does their biomonitoring. And these, it would look like, wow, they're doing a ton. If they ever could, this would be a lot of work, but to do it every year in all these places. But in fact, this is over starting, some of them are 1993, then there's some from 2000, there's some from 2005, some from 2009, 2014, and 2019. So you can see it's a range of between 5 and 7 years. And looking at those different sites, when you pull them up on the site, this is not live right now, but they say either non-impacted, and this is based on the macroinvertebrates they collect. So non-impacted, slightly impacted, or moderately impacted were the three kind of descriptors that I found in all of these areas. So thinking about, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about where I can say it now, where we found mostly non-impacted, but on the West Branch here below deposit, there were a couple that were moderately impacted, and then down here was slightly impacted. And most of these otherwise were, there's another, yeah, most of these other places were all just non-impacted. This is overlaid now with another source of data that they put out, which is how they call their assessment. When we're talking about stream assessment, they put together a list of water bodies and whether or not they are assessed or not assessed. And here we see the red is all the non-assessed, the unassessed streams, which is really interesting to think about, because you even see, like right here, you even see where there's a place where they did, in fact, do some biomonitoring. And in that case, that was back in 1994, I think that one was right here. But they've got a site, and for one reason or another, they did not feel that it could affect the unassessed nature of this summary. And then there's other places you can, it's hard to see, but along the main stem is orange, not red, and that's considered threatened. And then the only place in this screenshot that is impaired is this area from deposit on down right to hitting the corner here with where the river starts to be the border with Pennsylvania. And so there's a lot of things. There's more over here up in the Beaver Kill that is impaired, but there's a lot of things here that we could talk about that I'm happy to talk more about as we go further. But I wanted to say that this is a policy layer on top of the data that we're talking about here. And one of the things that I haven't yet been able to decipher is whether and how, to what extent New York State brings in the many other sources of data that are out there. So things like what's going on with private firms like Trotter Environmental, or universities like whether it's the Academy of Natural Sciences, or in Cornell, where Molly's been working with. What does it mean to collect enough data and to know that we want to have the data in the areas where you'll be doing projects, or you want to understand the benefit that can be given by those projects? I just brought up for a little bit more information. Here's the Delaware River Basin Commission monitoring sites along the main stem and just slightly off the main stem. These are also not taken every year, but more frequently than every 5 years. And then there's also here a snapshot of down at Callicoon, how the US Geological Survey has a station and collects several elements here: dissolved oxygen, pH, chlorides, which will be something that we'll talk about in a little bit. And they do have continuous monitoring for temperature as well, but they don't have many stations in the basin, in the upper basin. So it's just about the understanding what does, for the state of New York, assessment mean, and how does that play in? What I started with is the understanding what the quality of the water is, and then comparing it against standards. And what are standards? And so a little bit of kind of coming from the federal Clean Water Act comes to the state that requires the state to determine back in 1972 originally, and then over the years as things change, perhaps, what are the uses of the waters in the upper basin, and for that matter throughout the state. And so we have these categories that I'm showing you here. Again, pretty much similar snapshot of the map. Here's Hancock again, and here's the Pacton Reservoir. So they have categorized or classified, if you will, different waters into groups of activities. So the highest level, as you might imagine, AA is the most considered to be one of the most protected. They have a natural category, which is even more highly protected, but that there aren't natural waters designated or classified in this part of the basin. So in the AA, it's assumed, and this one that we have here that I've put an arrow next to is Abe Wood Brook going into Roscoe and into the Beaver Kill, and where the Willowema comes out or comes in. And that classification, if you will, is for drinking water with disinfection. And then they also have a classification of drinking water, but a little more treatment and disinfection. And as you can see, the two reservoirs have that bright pinkish color and are classified as A. The T symbols, as you might imagine, and I've got here on the legend, are when they are trout waters, classified as trout waters as well. The trout waters and trout spawning come into play when they want to control for or try to make sure there's adequate, mostly temperature protections on those waters. So some of the questions we've asked, for example, are whether or not all the waters that should have that T symbol are on there. And in fact, the Trout Unlimited has done a lot of work to make sure and document and try to communicate to the powers that be in Albany how and where the trout and trout spawning symbols should be in these classifications. But where they don't exist, I've got one here, which is a tributary to Trout Brook, that you don't have specifically called out those temperature protections. And so each one of these classifications and the uses tie back to what do I need to know in order to, getting back to my first question, how do we protect the things that we want to have happen out in these waters? And we need to understand what's going on there by sampling, and then we need to compare them to these standards. So going back just to this map is thinking about whether or not you are impaired or threatened should be comparing those standards against what they're finding out in the water body, if that makes sense. However, it's not necessarily clear that that's how they make this decision. It's more likely they're making this decision on what they're finding with macroinvertebrates, not whether or not there's enough dissolved oxygen, for example, which is one of the requirements for the cold water fishery. So I don't know, Molly, are there any questions? I just don't want to be plowing it through if there's a specific question so far about this idea of the classification. Okay.
No,
So-
yeah, no questions have come through yet.
So how we tie those these classifications that you find in the rules, in the New York rules, to whether or not we're going to protect them is interesting, because you have to understand which waters are the most sensitive to, in order to, step one being understand the quality, step two being protect the current water quality. What are the most sensitive uses? And identify and reduce the threats to them, perhaps. So most sensitive uses, they're things that you and I could think about off the top of our head. Where are those A and AA categories? Are they identifying all the right places where people are drinking water on or around the surface waters? There's a lot of places where groundwater is tricky, but there's groundwater wells that are very connected to surface waters. How does surface water protection play into what we're thinking about in terms of this sensitive use? Cold water fish, something that folks are very interested in. Are they identified adequately in the regulations in order to then for them to be protected when activities are happening in the basin? The fish might be requiring dissolved oxygen or temperature. The drinking water sources might make sure that we're not seeing too much sediment to get mucked up with an intake for a drinking water source. It also might be about nitrogen connected to the groundwater wells. The swimming holes, it most likely we'd be paying attention to bacteria, but we also could be paying attention to chemical problems with certain chemicals, maybe from hazardous materials nearby that may have washed in some way. So understanding the sensitive uses is important, and then identifying, and these are not activities that need to go away. These are activities that we need to identify and understand how they influence what's going on in the water body. And if you saw the Trout environmental presentation, it was really interesting to see where at the end of the tributaries, the sediment was being deposited, changing the direction of the main stem or the branches, and then affecting the other side of the river. Well, in the same way as those materials come down those tributaries, are they bringing an overabundance of nitrogen and phosphorus? Are they bringing extra sediment? Are they bringing road salt during the winter months? And where we see the active quarries or the construction sand processing facilities, are those fines and those silts and those materials also being flushed in inadvertently? And where there are places, there are some of these maps that we can get a hold of, say where hazardous materials are being kept in various places in the upper basin. So it's identifying, and it's not saying can't do this. It's about saying, how do we think about the practices that are associated? An example I wanted to show here is how, if you tie this information together, I've focused in on that stretch from deposit down past Hale Eddy. To remind you, the green is this one stretch was the impaired stretch of the water of the region that I had honed in on. And because it is classified as a B water, that means not only swimming and boating are protected, but that's the highest and best use of this area. It's not being listed as a drinking water source. And maybe if it is, if there's any intakes in this stretch, that should be corrected. But where there's also below, in addition to the swimming and boating, it's listed as a fishing area or as a protection for fishing, and it's also listed as shellfish harvesting and other aquatic life in that sense. So the way that they start the classification with A or B or C is considered the kind of the highest and best use, and otherwise there's a bunch of other things underneath there. So if we're looking at this one stretch, we see where there have been in 2009, they found that the bugs were moderately impacted there. In 1986 and 2014, they found slightly impacted. And so we're not seeing the data collection like year to year. So you all know more about what's going on in these stretches of water than the state possibly could, because they just aren't able to get out as often. There are, in this immediate area, there are three, this is another map that shows the sites of the permitted bluestone quarries, and these two on either side of this stretch of the West Branch are active and still permitted, and this one is recently closed and no longer active. So we might pay attention to whether or not there are sources of sedimentation coming out of those areas. And then the deposit has a wastewater treatment plant, and there's certain requirements for that wastewater treatment plant. And paying attention to these, again, these activities, these things going on is part of the process of tying the assessment. What is the quality we have with what does the state of New York recognize these water bodies to be good for? What are we doing here? And they translate that understanding of what these water bodies, if we go back to this map, what these water bodies might be used for, they translate that into how do we, what are the practices and the best management practices and the activities to control the any kind of pollutants that might be coming off site go into a permit or a plan based on what these classifications are. So they're important. And as we go thinking about this path to protection, and we tie maybe more of these sources of assessment out in the waters, the private, the universities, the other agencies, how, as New York does summarize the assessment and the quality of these upper Delaware waters and tributaries and the branches and the main stem, they are required to use all readily available data. And because of their focus on the macroinvertebrates first, and then to chemical sampling and chemical calculations later, there might be ways that that activities going on in the basin could be elevated to their attention. There are often, especially when it comes to volunteers, there are often significant hurdles for volunteer data to be used by a state agency, but there's a lot of ways that those data can be used as screening tools. Oh, we saw this problem. Maybe when you go back to do your sampling, you can pay attention to this area. And no doubt that that's happened cases. There's really an important need, as has been repeated a lot of times, even today, that maintaining this high quality of the Upper Delaware does equate to economic development, jobs, and a quality of life. And so tying the source water protection, thinking about how road salt is managed, thinking about how the quarries are actively taking care to make sure that things are not flowing off in storms off of their sites, thinking about wastewater management that is perhaps during the summer months, more of an issue in certain areas where there are retreat centers or campgrounds, and just thinking about how those seasonal wastewater inputs to the system might be affecting the waters. And thinking, as was mentioned earlier, there was a mention of septic upgrades, knowing how much of the basin is on septic is something worth paying attention to as well. So the take home, understanding how the state is assessing, understand how the state is classifying the waters, and knowing what you know about the waters to make sure we ask questions where that doesn't seem like maybe something is regarded in the way that its highest and best use is actually ongoing. And then thinking about how those uses and those classifications and the current quality play into what activities are being permitted and allowed to, add, whether it's sewage, treated sewage, or sediment, or even thermal inputs into the basin that will really have an impact back on those uses. So with that, I kind of threw the policy and some of the regulatory framework at you, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions and talk about other ways that the work going on can tie into the regulatory framework and improve it for the state of New York.
In the chat, Dan just noted one spot where there was the train derailment 4-ish years ago.
Yeah.
But no other questions came in at this point. Does anyone else? I don't know why I can't see when people raise their hands generally, but.
Yeah, I don't see any.
Okay. Tanya is saying she was able to get a graph of the scores. No, go, Tanya, you can go ahead and show that. You should be able to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. Okay, so this is MOS scores. So for those of you who don't know what a MOS score, it's a, oops, sorry. Too many windows. Let's move this over here. Okay. So what we want to focus on, these are MOS scores for just the bugs, just for the 2021 sites. And you can see that there's not a complete list of 25 sites. There was one site that we actually didn't get to. These are what we call IBI scores. They're indices of biotic integrity. It's a big fancy word that all it means is we count the bugs, we identify them, we look at all these different metrics, and then we calculate them together, and it helps us give a quality classification of poor, fair, or good. And there's two main IBIs that we use for macroinvertebrates, and the first is the PA IBI, and then another is the MOS score. MOS stands for Macroinvertebrate Aggregated Index for Streams. I'm showing the MOS scores because we have sites in New York and Pennsylvania, and so I feel kind of weird doing the PA IBI for sites that are in New York. So if the score is between a 6 or lower, it's considered a poor stream. If it's 13 to 6, that's a fair stream, and anything above a value of 13 is good. So you can see that about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Most of our streams are in the good range, fewer and fair, and this one right here is in the poor. And I was trying, while Gayle was talking, to figure out why this particular stream would be in the poor range, and I'm having a hard time figuring it out. The habitat assessment graded this stream as good, but on the very lowest end of good, like it was like a score of 102, and you have to have a score of 100 to be considered good. So it was the very low end. When I look at the pictures, I remember I was looking at the notes, there were lots of frogs here in this stream, and you can see the water has a lot of tannins in it. Actually, it was a really a dark color of the water, and it wasn't horrible. You can see there's a lot of riparian cover, but what you'll notice on this one bank here is that it doesn't look like it's a really solid foundation along that bank. So that bank probably, you know, a lot of that sediment deposits into the stream when it rains. There's a lot of runoff. There's lots of trees that have fallen over, which is actually not a bad thing because that provides organic inputs for those animals. And here are some beautiful boulders, but you can see again how the high levels of tannins are in the water. I remember being really surprised by this. So I'm not sure why these scores are like this. Sorry, did you have a question, Molly?
Oh, no, I was just humming over here.
Yeah, I don't know why it looks like this. So again, this is hot off the presses. You have the first look at these scores than anyone else, which is pretty exciting. And hopefully by the time we get through the rest of the data, we can extrapolate and tease out some of the reasons why these scores are the way they are. But for the most part, these headwater streams are really in good shape, you know, which is not a bad thing. You know, needs a little bit of work. Thankfully, Gayle gave us good streams and Friends of the Upper Delaware gave us streams to look at and consider policy and other factors. Any questions about that?
No questions came in while you were talking.
Okay.
So thank you again for sharing that with us.